Well, Jean and Andrew, thank you very much for coming. And to everybody who is watching, welcome to this webinar, which is the 12th, staged by a project being conducted by Adam Charnotta, Wojciech Sadurski, and me, Martin Krieger, on populism and constitutional democracy. The project is supported by the Australian Research Council, and in these webinars are held in cooperation with the Central European University's Democracy Institute. In them, we discuss the most important recent books dealing with contemporary populism and its implications, its causes, its spread, its likely future. And we do that with the authors of those books. They're recorded, and you can access any of them through the project's website, globalconpop, or one word, .blog, or on YouTube. There's also a podcast version, and you'll be notified when this one is edited and it appears online. Today, we'll discuss Populism and Civil Society, the Challenge to Constitutional Democracy, which is published this year by Oxford University Press and is written by our two guests, Andrew Arato, the Dorothy Hart-Hirschen Professor of Political and Social Theory in the Sociology Department at the New School of Social Research in New York City, and Jean Cohen, the Neil and Herbert M. Singer Professor of Political Thought and Contemporary Civilization at Columbia University. They join us from New York City. Our normal panel is Wojciech Sadurski, presently in Sydney, Adam Charnotta, who is now the rector of the Graduate School of Law in Riga, Latvia, is joining us from there, and I'm Martin Krieger, I'm also in Sydney. You've seen the flyer for the webinar, so I won't list all our panelists' multitudinous distinctions, positions, and contributions. It's enough to say that they're hugely distinguished students of contemporary socio-political predicaments and developments, and they have the relatively rare distinction among such students in political theory and the social sciences, that they also pay a great deal of attention to the legal and constitutional implications of such developments. That's true in a great deal of their writings over many years, and is particularly manifest in the book that we're going to be discussing today. But this book really speaks to virtually every question you should want to ask about populism and civil society. There's a distinctive and complex account of what populism is, and in particular its interwoven, but allegedly or argued to be hostile relationships with liberal democracy. There is a very close and detailed account of how populists mobilize to gain power and what they do when they get it. There are questions about why it occurs and why it is occurring now. There's an extended discussion of what Andrew and Jean, and this seems to be a central part of the logic of their book, what they call to be the distinctive logic, political logic of populists in power. There's insightful and close analysis of different stages of populists in relation to government power. And key for us, there are the constitutional implications and consequences of populism and power. And finally, a serious and deep consideration of what might be the alternatives to populism at a moment, which the authors argue the present is, when going back to status quo ante is not a serious alternative. So let me just ask our authors to flesh out some of these questions, and particularly, well, starting obviously with the concept itself. It's like all important normative concepts, hugely contested, controversial, and you, Andrew and Jean, have some considerable discussion of what at the core of your understanding of populism. Could you share a bit of that? You can choose in which order.
Andrew, I think you should start.
Okay. Of course, there are fundamental logical problems with answering the question, because reality, as I think Max Weber beautifully put it, is heterogeneous continuum. In other words, everything is close to everything else, and at the same time different. And so in that sense, any term like populism, fascism, even in the case when there is an attempt to homogenize structures, as in the case of communism, nevertheless, every single case is different. Just the participants here will realize that the communist regimes of Poland and Hungary were different, in spite of the fact that in institutional structures, many of them were forcibly homogenized in terms of some models. So populism too, of course, every single populism is different, and therefore to actually define the term is a hazardous activity, which we nevertheless need to do. Even historians, sometimes they protest against definitions and ideal types, but they use them. So we all have to use it, and we all have to define. And of course, it means that different definitions will lead to different sets. If you look at the major works now on our topic, and the many recent ones, you probably will all agree that the set of cases that they would include on their own definition would vary to some extent. There is, however, a significant overlap, and I think we are dealing to some extent, in spite of it all, with the same phenomenon. Now, in our case, and I don't want to say more about on this methodological level, is that we, because our suspicion, our underlying fear is that we're dealing with a phenomenon of authoritarianism that leads to authoritarian outcomes. We don't want to presuppose that on a level of definition. And so in terms of our definition, we have relied a great deal on Ernesto Laclau's attempt to systematically defend a concept which politically he considers to be potentially democratizing and leading to consequences quite other than what we would expect. Using his ideas in that way allows us to show the authoritarian trends which will not be assumed on a definitional level. I don't want to go through our list. I think everyone pretty much knows the concept of the people as a unified entity, the idea that that entity should be sovereign, that that entity can be embodied in a political group or movement or political party, and that in fact ultimately it can be even embodied in a single leadership. We also stress that one of the ways of isolating this entity is through a friend-enemy relationship. So it is not only populism is not only a form of self-definition, but it is also almost all in every single case a definition and depiction of its fundamental antagonist. Just to mention a difficulty, when one proceeds this way, one runs into the possible difficulty that other phenomena, for example, the Stalinist version of communism or fascism, in many respects would fall under that particular definition as Laclau developed it and as we have taken it over. So we correct the immanent criticism or defining true immanent criticism by two characteristics that do not correspond or do not identify either either authoritarian communism or fascism. And these two phenomena are the electoral dimension and the interest in constitutions as not just paper documents, but as in some ways depiction of how the proposed system operates. I'll stop with this. There are other things to say, but I won't talk about them now. Is that once we define it this way, in our conception, there can be different organizational forms in which the phenomenon exists. We stress in this context movement, party, and a component of government, the core of government or the government, and then even the possibility of a regime with new political rules.
Yes.
I stop with this.
Thank you.
I'll stop with this.
Shall I add something, or do you want to open it up?
Sure. One thing Andrew said at the beginning that your definition deliberately doesn't include questions of authoritarianism. And you insist in the book that there is a specific logic, political logic to populists, and that this logic, as you work it through, is definitely, not just accidentally, authoritarian. Could you, Jean, give us some detail on how that comes out of your?
I mean, I just wanted to add one small thing to the way in which our ideal type differentiates or would distinguish populism from, let's say, fascism, which is a contemporary issue, and Stalinism, which Anna didn't mention, and is that populism is a thin ideology. That's a theme that Casmuda argued, that relies on and makes use of host ideologies. And what's interesting is that the host ideologies can be ranging from the left to the right, at least traditionally considered that way, and which is why, of course, you can end up with left and right wing populism. So I just wanted to add that.
Sure.
As to the logic and dynamics of it, I mean, as an ideal type, so the logic and dynamics is obviously built into the 7 dimensions of the ideal type: part, whole, pars pro toto, friend, enemy, embodiment, logic, and we flesh out how that works. But the point is that on different levels, on the level of the movement especially, it's very hard to pinpoint. Or first of all, it's very hard to differentiate between populist and non-populist movements, because many of them, everybody says we are the people. 100 people in Zucchetti's sphere, Zucchetti's square, claim to be the people, and that goes way back. We know that. So on the level of movement, it's very fluid. You can have all kinds of actors involved in law and dynamics, but the closer a movement party, a party in government, and then as the government approximates the dimensions of the ideal type. I mean, not every movement has a leader in this sense, but the more closely it approximates it, I think, then the logic of then the dynamic of the type of that we described plays out. So
and what is that dynamic which leads
I think that especially if it involves a friend-enemy articulation, not just who is the real people, but excluding some members of the population and citizens as well from the people as part of it, framing them as the enemy, including the opposition in parliament or wherever, the other parties. That's one. But as an enemy as an enemy, not just an opponent, not just a competitor, right? And then I think that the idea that a part of the people is excised from the people to stand for the whole people, and then often invited a leader, that too unleashes, and they are the true people as opposed to what everybody else thinks they are. That unleashes, and of course, obviously, an anti-pluralist monist dynamic that linked up with the friend-enemy frame, and the idea that the anti-establishment stance, which is very important. I don't remember if we put that clearly enough in the ideal type, but being anti-establishment is very important because it's a stance that's maintained even when they're in power, as you know. So that means whatever goes, they're never responsible for anything. Those populists in power, either at being in government like Trump or the whole government, they're never responsible. There's always somebody else, the deep state, aliens, I don't know. And so if you add those together, at least those 3 elements. Now, obviously, being wed to elections is not part of the authoritarian logic, because on that level, they claim to be part of the democratic imaginary and claim democratic legitimacy. But if you take the other dimensions that we mentioned, it unleashes a dynamic that would make it, for example, also hard to tolerate protest and opposition in civil society if they're in the government. How can the people in civil society contest the populist government if they embody the will of the true people? So if you follow, it's many stages, but if you follow the logic of this out, or the steps of it, then what many others have pointed to, I mean, Muller points to the anti-pluralist stuff, but that's not enough. There's more. Then they even undermine, then this dynamic actually even perverts the meaning of election itself, because elections are no longer there to ensure accountability and alternation. I mean, they're just there for a claim and for a kind of legitimacy that is, well, I mean, more and more plebiscitarian, more and more quasi-Bonapartist, and less democratic.
Could you, I mean, expand on both that? I mean, one of the curious things, for example, about Poland and Hungary is that the government doesn't kill anyone and doesn't even arrest too many people. And the elections are, they're not fixed. They're played with, and all sorts of things are done to make them unfair, the playing field unfair, but they're real elections in some ways. And people in Poland are wondering whether the government, it's a serious wonder, it's not a fantasy, whether the government will lose the elections next year. So if you say that, and then the other element which you stress, which is so important and also important for our project, which is the strange relationship with, maybe not strange, but the particular relationship to law, that law is not just a facade, it's not rejected in the way Lenin rhetorically rejected law, but it's a serious business of some sort. How does this fit within the this kind of driving logic of authoritarian development?
Well, I think Andrew knows Eastern Europe much better than me, Hungary and Poland. So why don't you answer that one?
Well, here's the thing. If you define the phenomenon the way we did, and I think you're quite correct in stressing the relationship to election and law. If you define it this way, then I think one will find a fundamental tension or contradiction in the phenomenon. Perhaps this is a consequence of mixing levels. The imminent criticism of Laclau's conception leads to a logical set of categories, whereas elections and to some extent the engagement in constitutional politics are empirical phenomena. Nevertheless, if one doesn't want to be too far from reality, one has to recognize, my colleague Federico Finkelstein has stressed this dimension, that unlike fascism, he doesn't stress communism, one is dealing with a set of projects which involve elections, which one has to be careful with this, which are to some extent, let's say, free and fair, and this, of course, creates a logical problem, right? Because if one group, let's say one party, or one individual or spokesman are the ones who legitimately speak for the people, how can they lose an election, right? How do you test something like that, right? I mean, just to give you an example, which people here will recognize, if the Supreme Pontiff is the legitimate spokesman for the Church, and if his statements define ex cathedra the current doctrine of the Church, this is not open to electoral contestation. It is not exposed to refutation through the empirical people saying, yes, but that's not what we think about our religion. So in a way, there is a problem. And this is a problem that I think is a way of answering your question, that the authoritarian logic, which will not be realized in every single instance, means that not just elections, but separation of powers, the rule of law will represent problems from the point of view of the self-understanding, the self-definition of a populist who is in government. If a populist movement may find problems with these things too, but they're not in position to abrogate separation of powers or to challenge it or to replace the rule of law by arbitrary will in some instances, or to deform elections and make them less free or less fair. We all know that governments are capable of doing any one of these things. And so populism in government shows the authoritarian aspect of its logic most clearly, even though it is already potentially decipherable in populist movements. When populism is a powerful component of government, when it controls several of the governmental branches, then its authoritarian dimensions fully come into view, and those things that we empirically discern in certain cases, like Hungary, let us say in 2010, will be nevertheless precarious components of the system. I leave it up to you to say if rule of law, if separation of powers have become precarious in Poland in this period. I mean, I think it's important to note that the governmental position of the Polish governing party is weaker than the position of Viktor Orban was already in 2010. And so the question is not just a question of the logic, but also the question of how much power is actually available to serve the logic.
Sure.
Right.
Oh, sorry, Jean.
Just one small thing, because actually I think the example of the Pope, there was an example, right, is an important one to understand, at least I think, how according to this definition, how a populist leader understands election. I mean, popes are elected too, supposedly, but of course they're not elected. They're selected. They are selected. So what's the logic? If the logic of it is there's one right answer. And once you select the Pope, of course, that's the right answer, right? And so there's no alternative opposition. That's the end. And in a way, there's something very similar to, I think, the way a populist leader understands the election. This kind of embodiment, it is a political theology after all, the embodiment of the true will, of the general will of the true people, and there can only really be one. And so I just wanted to add that it's illuminating, because the use of democratic legitimacy is so central. On the other hand, I think, as Andrew's right, it depends on what kind of power you have, but you end up with problems and tensions so I mean, in effect, if elections can be lost on the national level, well, I mean, then it hasn't stepped off then the populist regime system, whatever it is, hasn't stepped off the map of a kind of very, very, very deeply flawed democracy. But if it can't be lost, we're in a different frame. There are other dimensions to this too.
I mean, you have those famous quotes from Chavez and Orban about Orban, the nation can't lose the election. Chavez,
I was just thinking that.
Right.
Haza nem lehet ellenzékbe. The homeland cannot be in opposition.
No.
That's right. Wojciech, you were going to ask, what you have, Andrew and Jean, you characterize populist regimes as a sort of hybrid, and I know that Wojciech has been thinking about that. Maybe this is a time for him to come in and ask about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And first of all, Jean and Andrew, thank you for your great book. It is really both monumental in size, but also in depth and fulfilled aspirations. So it's a really great book. And let me start with this very, very sincere congratulations. My question, or my perhaps comment, may be a little bit, may seem pedantic, and I guess it is, but it is a question about characterization. It's a question really about labels, but they are more than labels, because when we decide to call a particular regime or system in a particular way, we already supply certain theory rather than just a starting definition. So specifically, I'm interested in the reasons for your rejection of the concepts of competitive authoritarianism or electoral authoritarianism for the really existing populism. And here is the reason for my question. So at certain point in chapter 4 of your book, you discuss a number of possible labels for these new types of regimes, which are currently, so to speak, on the market in political science. And on the one hand, you reject certain democracies with qualifiers, like illiberal democracy or perhaps failed democracy, etc. And you suggest that this is not a right way of calling these regimes because it sort of overestimates or exaggerates the democratic ingredient to it. And I fully agree with that. And this is also the position I have taken in my work on populism. On the other hand, you also reject the, if you like, the opposite way of defining those regimes, starting with authoritarianism, but then qualifying the noun with some adjectives such as competitive or electoral. And I do not really understand very well why you insist on rejecting those points, especially after what both of you have just said, that this electoral, in other words, competitive aspect is so defining for populisms. Why not? Why insisting on a hybrid character, which is there to stay, which is sort of, which may be permanent? Well, to most people, I guess hybridity is not a great explanation of anything, because it just says there is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But what this or that is still remains to be described. So this is my question. Say competitive authoritarianism as one of possible labels for the regimes we are talking about.
Right. I'd like to begin an answer to that, because this is a chapter we argued most about, and it's also the hardest to draw the thresholds among these regimes. It really is. The impulse was to avoid actually pinpointing a regime like a butterfly, or a populism like a butterfly in a pin, because it shifts so much. And first of all, in the various stages, movement party, in government, the government, right? All of these involve shifts. The second was, as you already noticed, the problem with the illiberal democracy, that's an ideological formulation. I think that's more of an, Orban pretends that liberal democracy, or the theory behind it, that liberal democracy is an oxymoron. On the contrary, I would argue that illiberal democracy in our current day is the oxymoron. So that's clear. The competitive authoritarian thing was harder, because actually the theorists of it, they do two things. First of all, they construe it as a hybrid regime. That's them. Second of all, the electoral I won't get into. Second of all, they Levitsky and Wayne, in a later article, I don't think it was, I had read it or what it was done by the time we did this book, actually referred to populism as a form of competitive authoritarianism in Latin America. So that's what they do. But the problem for me is twofold. One is, of course, what's the most interesting is the process of hybridization. You could call it, other people have called this democratic backsliding, whatever you want to call it, but it's a process of hybridization. But what does that process involve? It's not just that, people in power are being naughty, they're violating some civil liberties, they're messing around with some of the rule of law, the elections are decreasingly free and fair. That all really matters. But I tried to think about this more in a newer paper, and I tried to say in some way they're kind of creating the hybridization dynamic kind of creates, it's going to sound strange, but authoritarian enclaves within the system. And it would be important to note at what point these really transform the whole system itself. But before I get to that, the problem with the concept of hybrid vis-a-vis competitive authoritarianism, we use the example of a mule. I mean, a mule isn't a type of, no, maybe it's not. Which one is it? A mule, I think it is. It's not a type of donkey, and it's not a type of horse, right? So that's, in a way, the concept of hybrid regime, I think, should be a type in itself. So competitive authoritarian, it's authoritarian from day one. But then there's no logic to it. It's just, so the minute Orban's elected is authoritarian. No, I don't think that works. And on the other side, a liberal democracy, well, no, I think that these regimes tend to be anti-democratic, not simply anti-liberal. And I think the distinction today is, it's not a distinction without a difference. There can be extremes on either side, but you get the drift of this. So we tried to think of the idea of hybrid regimes with subtypes. So also, there are many competitive authoritarian regimes that these thinkers think of, and I didn't come up with a new name for their studies, but many of them are not populist. They don't involve mass mobilization. They don't involve many, that kind of a leader. Populists are populist regimes are mobilizational. They're no longer anti-establishment. So we tried to come up with an idea of a variety of subtypes, populist being one subtype of a hybrid regime. I mean, it's reified, it might not work, but the issue was also, we were thinking of what kind of contestation is possible in each type of structure. And in a way, once you've sort of gone there, you have to be able to say, although it's very hard, when you've gone off the map of a really flawed democracy to a hybrid regime that it's really be stretching it to call it democracy. I don't know if Erdogan, however you say this, he lost a local election, but I don't know if he's the one who lose a national election. I don't know. And so, I mean, the problem was really to think of, it's almost easier to think of the threshold from a populist hybrid to an authoritarian regime, because there we tried to argue, we used Ernst Frankel's dual state theory. And there really, once the rule of law there's no rule of law in a dual state. There are areas where normative legal systems operate, but it's the idea that the will of those in power decide. They have KK, competence. Anyway, so I'll stop there.
Can we, I mean, because we're lawyers, but also because it's so central to the distinctiveness of many modern populist regime, and it's something that you emphasize in your book, and that is, in what you were just saying, Jean, you emphasized the inauthenticity of the rule of law, even though it's promoted, but yet it is being promoted. And Adam, I know, is interested in that and wants to ask about it. And so, please, Adam.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for the book. And on the personal side, it means I met both of you in 1985, I believe, in Dubrovnik, in the university sector. So that's after many years again. But as Martin mentioned, we are lawyers. I am a lawyer, so nobody is perfect. I'm not a political theorist. And one sentence in the book actually, focused my attention. When you describe the constitutional replacement in Hungary on page 169, you wrote, thus, if in 1989 some could speak of a revolution taking a legal form, Scholium Rechtsstaatliche Revolution, in 2010 the same could be said about a coup d'etat, the end of citation. The question is simple, but short, but maybe not simple. What is special about law in our time that liberal and populist revolutions are made through law?
Who's going to answer this?
Well, I could say, well, go ahead, Andrew, you do it. I'll say something later. I mean, fascisms came to power through law too.
Coming to power is one thing, but exercising it so often in legal.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating topic. First of all, what is the condition of law under a populist regime, and we half rely on Ernst Frankel's dual state as a way of pinpointing what would be a fully authoritarian setting, because I think that Adam will agree that even fascist regimes use law in all kinds of ways that resemble the way we use law in liberal democratic ones. I'm not an expert on communist law, but I suspect that in many areas of life, something like legal regulation plays a role there as well. Marriages, divorces, adoptions. I don't want to talk to economic matters, property questions, but even their personal property. Laws work in a normal sense in those settings as well. So what Frankel's great contribution was to argue that nevertheless there is a second legal dimension in all such regimes, the prerogative state, which can always trump, which can always overrule decisions or outcomes that emerge from the normative sphere. Now, what we say is that that populist regimes do not take the full step to an authoritarian outcome. That the question of the priority of which law is not resolved.
Right.
It's undecided. So we have a rule of law regime in which these are ideal types, in which the normative is prior. Of course, there's a lot of discretion in every political legal order. The authoritarian regimes, whether communist or fascist, where the prerogative is primary. And then what we put in between them, and this is perhaps part of the hybridity, is that both regimes coexist, but their relationship, their priority between them is undecided. Now, this helps answering Adam's question, because it means that because of that, one cannot do with elections. I don't know if this is what the Russian government would do in case the electoral results turn out badly, but I suspect that some ways they would falsify them, they would alter them, and we know about elections in fully authoritarian states. That's not available in the case of this hybrid type, and so as a result, the law has to be taken more seriously. In terms of origins, I don't think the problem is great. As Jean said, even Mussolini and Hitler did well in elections and came to power not because they won outright, but they did very well. They both had pluralities at certain points, right? And so electoral beginnings, or the use of ordinary constitutional law in coming to power, is in common, even with among populisms and of course fascism too. The puzzle is why and for what reason law remains as important when populists are in power. And I think it has to do with the undecided nature of the ultimate decision-making capacity within the legal system. So law remains important. Now, of course, and this is what Jean has stressed, there's a possibility of another transition to an authoritarian system in which elections will be basically performances, and the incumbents cannot lose. I don't think that was the case in Hungary, in the recent election.
No,
Uh,
no.
Even though Orban or Fidesz again got over 50% and thereby the 2/3, I don't believe the election was, there was manipulation, there were attempts to influence it, but it remained to some extent free and fair in compared to any communist state or certainly a fascist one. And this, I think, is part of the self-understanding of these regimes, and they will challenge it only when in ultimate danger. That would be the interesting question. In Venezuela, we know that was decided in the direction of an authoritarian outcome, but that has not been the case. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, also the case of Morales, there were attempts, it didn't work. But I just wanted to add one small thing, and that is that because populists are dependent on democratic legitimacy, which is not reducible to elections, and despite their own ideological claims that somehow liberalism, and you never know what the hell they mean by that. Sometimes they mean the rule of law, sometimes they mean constitutionalism. It's up for grabs what they mean by liberalism. Sometimes they mean, rights, etc. But actually, the legitimacy that they're dependent on involves that as well. It doesn't involve the rule of law. It doesn't involve the rights. They want to come out, and especially because one of their main points of critique of the corrupt establishment is corruption. And then when they come into power, of course, they engage in their own forms of that, very specific ones. But in any case, I think that this is also a reason why it's that there's a tension in and there's a need to embrace the rule of law or not undermine openly the rule of law.
Since none of us is supporting authoritarianism, then the question is, well, what are the options? What are the alternatives? And you've got a particularly rich final chapter, which is not at all, well, we should get back what we had, but explores a range of other alternatives in some detail. And I'd like listeners to get some sense of at least the main thrust, not the specifics, it's not a short chapter, but the main thrust of or direction of where you think the alternatives are to be found. What sort of alternatives would be available and acceptable to this very widespread trend?
I mean, if I can answer that, in a way, we work out, we didn't talk about this so much, the why now question, causality, why is it happening in so many places? But once you do that, and I try to explain it as we do, then I think the alternative has to be generated in relationship to that. And so we say very, very shortly, very quickly, that there is a ultimate or primary cause of these phenomena, which after all have been with us since the French Revolution in one way or the other. And that is the tension between our two basic principles, constitutionalism and democracy. And we suggest that that tension has to be dealt with if the problem is going to be dealt with adequately. And so the problem is, on that level, democratization. Our history of democracy has had many episodes of democratization. Even France, which never really had decent local government, has it today. Much more importantly, perhaps, suffrage has been expanded in all our democracies in a significant way. So the liberal democracy is a history of democratization. To the extent that populism is an important threat, I would say that democratization has been to some extent stopped. Not Kevin Crouch, what is his first name? Colin Crouch, right? Colin Crouch thinks about democratization as a parabola, and I don't think of it as exactly as that, because I think there's a linear aspect to democratization too. But there is a parabolic aspect, and when the parabola hits the bottom, in that sense, democratization has been weakened. Therefore, then populists can challenge existing system from a supposedly democratic point of view. And I think that the first answer, first step toward finding an alternative is resume democracy as democratization. And I just very briefly then about the other steps, the problem of representation, which is related to democratization. I think we have to think about forms of representation that compensate for the fact that existing forms have a kind of oligarchic tendency. I mean, Schumpeter is not the only one who has noted it. And there our civil society project remains an important one. Yes, civil society is also possibly the birthplace of populist challenges, but that does not mean that we should not try to resume this very, very interesting strategy. I mean, I learned it from Poland, basically, in the very early 1980s. But of course, it's much older than even Solidarity and the Polish project was. So civil society as a dimension, which has to be somehow reoccupied. This is what Gene and I call a dualistic strategy. And finally, just one more word, okay? Yeah. One more word is that populism uses host ideologies. And these host ideologies are important things to recover. And so I would say that that we have to take seriously the claims of social welfare and even the claims of the nation in order to come up with an alternative. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, this leads very directly to a concern of our two Polish patriots on the screen, Adam and Wojciech, who both were involved in Solidarity at that time. Pardon me. I find it so emotioning. Adam, I think, has one question about this, specifically the relationship with the Solidarity experience, and maybe this is the moment to ask it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, Martin mentioned that in my youth, yes, that was I participated in this movement, which was a populist movement, actually, Solidarność, right? And my question is purely theoretical. It means my reading of your book is that you see this democratization potential in the populist as a social movement. So the question is possible, what are the conditions to keep this populist movement on civil society level? It means you describe this logic that it will go to the power, right? But is possible, basically, what are the conditions, right? Is possible to imagine the conditions to keep it only as a movement which will lead to or push towards a permanent democratization?
I'd like to, excuse me, Andrew, I'd like to answer that for 1 second. So I think that that behind what you said is the impulse to describe all popular social movements as populist. I think that's, first of all, misleading. Second of all, I came to our civil society stuff, don't forget I'm American, not Hungarian, from what? From the new social movements of the 60s and 70s, of course. These weren't political parties. These were movements that attempted to organize and influence power, not to form or take power. Okay. I'm not to exercise power. They're not parties. But the idea was to influence the parties that do exercise and make collectively binding decisions. I think that I don't think that I would not frame the problem as keeping the movements within civil society. I would frame the problem as we kind of did in the book, the one you raised, as when movements form parties, become movement parties, once they enter into power, the important step is to, in some sense, normalize. And in a way, Solidarity did that. They didn't remain the one unifying, overarching, only legitimate, movement expression of political actors, right? Regardless of what happened later. And so I think it's important to think along those lines. And then finally, I would say that unless, democratization occurs on two levels. One is inclusion of the excluded, and the other is the procedural. In other words, every country has flaws in its constitutional institutional design, and sometimes they become really problematic, and they need to be reformed. and supplemented with other democratic forms. Andrew was arguing about that, but I also think we have to take very seriously, as we do, the more contextual problems that generate populist responses. So obviously the extremes of inequality, the technological transformations, but also the anxieties about social status, which I think that when somebody like Hillary Clinton said, oh, well, these people are just the deplorables, that was completely disastrous, because actually people who she was referring to are suffering and are having status anxieties. The goal, I mean, what an intelligent party, Democratic left party, would have to do is to articulate the anxieties in ways that can be addressed and be inclusive instead of parochial and back to the idea of our status rise means your status loss. I mean, there would have to be another way to formulate that, and that's in a way that the book ends. That the status anxieties are real; they're not some kind of crazy thing. The economic anxieties are real, and the loss of voice and parties who speak for you are real. And they each have to be addressed in their own way, obviously country by country. So,
which Wojciech's in the last webinar we were discussing Wojciech's recent book, pardon me, Pandemic of Populists, and in your last chapter, Wojciech, you discuss in rather overlapping ways, it seemed to me, some of the options available to anti-populist Democrats in the modern world. I'd like if you could come in with some reflection.
Look, the overlap came from a very simple matter. I was so greatly impressed by Jean's article in Uskogens, which later made its way into the last chapter of the book, that I expressly cited and referred to it as some sort of a general template for the post-populist democratic politics, trying to take seriously all those claims and anxieties which brought populists to power and convert them into genuinely liberal or libertarian in political sense, universalistic type of non-toxic slogans. But let me, not slogans, sorry, ideas, programmatic part. So in that sense, my last chapter is largely derivative from Jean's paper, which I liked very much and which I saw went in an enlarged way into the book. But let me just ask one question, one very specific question related to those alternatives chapter, and I think it will be a short question because I think that that we soon should allow Q&A to our participants. But the book is about a point which you make in your last chapter, which wasn't in Jean's article to which I had just referred, and that is this idea of consensus democracy, an idea that democracy should be based on consensus and translated into constitutional language and into very practical language. It says that, and I quote, when it comes to constitutional making and constitutional change, assumedly in this post-populist period, I quote, there should be a multi-leveled set of rules of constitutional change requiring lower degrees of consensus for technical change and much higher levels for principled change involving the basic structure and especially replacement, that is constitutional replacement. And I just wonder how you can, and of course it's a very worthy, very noble aspiration, but how can you reconcile this aspiration with an extremely high degree of polarization, which we will see once populists lose elections? Because populists do come to power largely due to polarization, and they cherish and they consolidate this polarization. So the Democrats in a post-populist state won't have this luxury of being able to rely on anything like a consensus for constitutional replacement or constitutional change.
Okay, so Before I answer that question, just one brief remark on Poland. That is, as you probably all know, I also been writing about solidarity. You were active within it, but I wrote about it. And so I have a real attachment to that history and real interest in it still. My feeling is that it contained a populist dimension, and it contained also a civil society-oriented democratic dimension. And these things could be articulated by different leaders, on different venues. It's a question of how you define populism to some extent. And I think even our definition, you will find some populist dimension. Now, is that true for all social movements? That would be, Jean said something to that effect before. Social movements very often have a dimension like this, but is it dominant? Is it the one that actually becomes the basis of strategic outcomes and innovations? And I think in the Polish case, it's demonstrable that the outcome was not a populist government, after the negotiations. Now, it's true, one can show that perhaps from that time on, there is a wing of the former Solidarity activists completely dissatisfied with the bargaining structure and the negotiations and their outcome. And so a new populism emerges from those seats. And I think perhaps even the current Polish government has its origins, at least the leader does, in that type of dissatisfaction. So I think that movements don't have to lead to populist governments, even if the populist dimension is present in them. But I think we should be aware of it, and it's a possibility. Poland may be an interesting example that it can happen in a period of time. I mean, obviously, Lech Walesa was the candidate for a populist leader, and sometimes he really did fit into the stereotype. But on some level, he remained, I think, faithful to the democratic aspirations of other parts of the movement. Now, what Wojciech is raising is the question of this complicated constitutional structure we suggest toward the end of the book. And I think, first of all, that a multi-leveled constitutional amendment structure exists in lots of places. Even the United States, if you think about it, has potentially 4 formulas for constitution making, though these are not hierarchically organized. But even we have elements of the Constitution that cannot be changed. And so that represents a higher level too. And the same for the Grundgesetz and so on. I think better illustrations are the Indian and the South African of that possibility. Now, obviously, such a structure is very difficult to operate. And your question is, could it be operated at all under conditions of societal polarization? In other words, can you actually operate a multi-leveled democratic constitution if the societal conflicts are too deep? I don't know the answer to that, but it would seem to me that on a multi-level basis, you can at least use relatively lower consensus requirements, sometimes even simple majority rule. The Indian constitution had that provision for certain of its parts, which could be decided through majority changes. Other parts were required much higher consent. And of course, the basic structure doctrine of the court created a very high threshold for certain things. India has been a fairly polarized society some of the time, and yet they managed to work. South Africa is another example. So I think, in a way, the way I reinterpret your question is that a multi-level structure would allow for both easier and more difficult changes, and therefore it would not make the mechanisms of constitutional change hostage to the polarization problem. Now, of course, a polarized society is never going to change anything really important in its constitution, but that would be true, I think, for almost any amendment rule. I mean, the only thing, perhaps Great Britain, United Kingdom, no matter how polarized they are, a simple majority can change, whatever it is that we would say is impossible to change. For example, here is an example which is not sexist like the one I was thinking of. Even a simple majority can take the UK out of the European Union. That's a disaster, right? That's a disaster for such a change to occur on that level. So in a way, polarization is exploitable for constitutional purposes only in the case of a simple structure. The structure we suggest would guard against radical constitutional change unless different social groups can come to agree. So if Brexit would have required 2/3 in the referendum and then 2/3 of parliament, it would have been better for everybody, including the Brits themselves.
Thank you. I think that's a good point to now switch to Q&A from the audience and who is going to volunteer. And since I see some usual suspects in the audience, if you don't volunteer, I'll very quickly volunteer you. All right. Boyan.
Will we hear this, or you'll say?
Yes, I hope so. So we have a very distinguished cast, and one of them was the subject with Mark Tushnet of an earlier webinar we had, and I'm hoping I will be able sufficiently to oh, he's disappeared. That's wondrous. Oh, no, there he is. Good. Excellent.
I'm just doing my magic in the background.
Okay, excellent. I'm sorry, Boyan, to inflict this duty on you, but we couldn't do without you. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure. I'll be very short. I will be very short in the praise of the book, but I really enjoy it. I read the whole book, and I really like particularly the answer to the problems, which is more democratization, which was very rare in this series of discussion that we had about populism. It was usually the push towards the other direction, which is toward more liberalism. So I'm totally with the authors on that part. And the question where I would like to push the authors a little bit further is when it comes to the fourth chapter, which is the relationship between populism and constitutionalism. And I really like how I see them very different from Müller, for example, and Urbinati, by not saying that constitutionalism as such is always, in all instances, antithetical. Populism is always antithetical with populism. So I thought that was a very important difference between this book and the books that we discussed earlier by Nadia Urbinati and Müller, who said that populism as such is always, in all instances, antithetical to constitutionalism. But then when it comes to the empirical part, they rely very heavily on the discussion of Latin American cases. And in chapter 4, on pages, I remember this because there were important quotes, pages 81 and 82, they seem to suggest that in the end of the day, populists, they agree, they actually say explicitly, we agree with Gabor Halmai, who says, that populist constitutionalism is an oxymoron. And I don't agree with that. I mean, there are cases, few of them, but they show that you can have democratic populist constitutionalism. There was a short-lived Syriza government in Greece, they were democratic populist, and by any account, they would never fit into any typology of this, anti-constitutional or authoritarian populist. They were defeated, they were very weak, the entire European Union was against them. But, even by account of Kasmude, they were more or less largely, following the script of the key constitutional liberal standards that went together with their populist program. Then, I can name a little bit more of them, but here is my point. I think that the key question in here is whether populism has this authoritarian drive as something that is indigenous to populism or something that is exogenous. Because as you correctly point out, populism, takes many different host ideologies. And my thinking is that it's exogenous. So if you have populists who adopt democratic, liberal, even liberal, political ideologies, then you have democratic constitutional populism. If you have the opposite, if you have the authoritarians, different source, different variation, then of course you end up on this anti-constitutional, anti-liberal spectrum. But that's empirical question, not theoretical question. So, for example, if you read, for example, the populist platform of the American Populist Party in 1892, it reads like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And I know this is a very old historical example, but to conclude, I think the key question is try to look at the empirical cases more carefully and allow for the possibility that there are also democratic populist constitutionalists, and they are rare, but that's a separate question. Why there are so few? And I'm not a political scientist, but I like the way that some political scientists are going. I know that there's some future work promised here, and my understanding is that basically the fact that we have so many authoritarian populists is simply the mirror image of the weakness of the political left. But that's that has nothing to do with sort of inherent predisposition of populism toward authoritarianism. Thank you.
Yeah, do you want us to answer?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. All right, I'll start. I'm sure Andrew will then take over. So, I mean, there are people, there's an article actually by James Mansbridge and Steve Macedo that wants to argue the same thing you argued, that that the authoritarian part, they reduce populism to a very narrow definition, the people against the establishment, and I can't remember what else is in there, and the authoritarian part they say is exogenous. But I understand the impulse, because the impulse comes from the idea that yes, movements that either label themselves populist, like the American populist movement, although that's very early, or are considered populist or seem populist, have populist elements, often can be democratizing in the sense that either they want to include groups that have been excluded, or make or improve the procedural on the procedural level, the democracy that they're in, to make them more democratic, less flawed, et cetera, which is what the American populists pushed. So that's right. But then one would have to explain why in so many cases, really most cases, there is this affinity with and turn towards authoritarianism. And what we try to do in terms of, we already discussed all this, but in terms of the analyzing the logic of it, I mean, you have to say what's populist about, I mean, for example, about if you want to, well, I'll give you an example. So actually, I don't think that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, or even, I never can say his name, Tsipras in Greece, I can't say the name, but anyway, are populist. Or there's something else you could say. Sanders and Warren, not at all, at least not in our definition. So you must be operating with a different definition. Secondly, even in terms of the case of Greece, you can shift. You can start out in a populist mode and then shift and no longer be populist when you're in power. You can become, for whatever reason. Now, where we agree fully is that populism is going to emerge in a context when there's something wrong with the dynamic of democratic representation. The system is flawed in ways that it's not adequately and sufficiently democratic. I fully agree with that. But in terms of what we described as the ideal typology of populism, neither Bernie Sanders nor Elizabeth Warren nor, for example, Nelson Mandela were populists. In fact, think of Mandela. He had everything. He had the whole society. I mean, in a sense, I mean, except for a few people named the whites, but he refused the populist move. He said, no, I am not the embodiment of the entire people. No, I'm not going to play that card. I'm going to play something else. So I think that the burden would then be on you to explain what your concept of populism is. Is it just, I don't know, more democratization, nice left politics, or is it? And then you have to explain why in so many of the contemporary cases, so many of them, including, by the way, the American Populist Party, don't forget, when they emerged with the Democrats and supported Bryan, they flipped into an unbelievably racist mode which they were not before. Their main, what's his name? Tom, not Stopper, I'm blocking his name. Their key figures, what? No, Brian, there's somebody else who was I'm blocking his name. They're key figures, not from the Democratic Party, but from their own party, where when they had been initially wooing Black populists in the South, we're talking the Jim Crow epoch, the minute there was a chance for power with Bryan, they thought, right, flipped over and embraced an extremely virulent form of racism and anti-Semitism and everything else. So I'm not saying that that's inevitable, but it happens many, many times. On the other hand, many of the very democratizing forms they supported were then taken over by the progressives and institutionalized. So I'll stop there.
Let me make a contribution to this, because I think it's a very, very important question and counter hypothesis. But Boyan, if we can be a first name basis, what Boyan suggests is that authoritarianism is the function of the host ideologies. That's what he said. In other words, there is a lot of authoritarianism in the populist experiments, but that must be derived from the hosts that they adopted, because being a thin ideology, accepting that idea of ours, but it is not ours, but Müller and Kaltwasser used that term, and in a way it's consistent with Laclau. The thin ideology requires a host, and the hosts are the ones that produce. Now, I would wonder what you think about the counter hypothesis, which is in a way synthetic in relationship to our views and yours. In other words, what if you interpret the host ideologies through non-populism? For example, let's assume that a liberal, and I think ultimately Edward Bernstein is a liberal, when a liberal adopts socialism, is the outcome authoritarian? No, it's social democracy, right? Even I don't think I'm not a nationalist either for Hungary or for the United States, but I think nationalism can exist in democratic forms. It need not be authoritarian, right? And I would say that even religion, which often is linked to authoritarian views, can be linked to democratic aspirations. So my counter hypothesis to you would be, that isn't it ultimately most likely that it is a synthesis, namely of a populist defined as we try to define it, with a host that leads to authoritarian outcomes. So socialism, yes, I think that there is socialism is the host for many Latin American cases. So I don't think it's correct to say that when the left provides the host ideology, the outcome is not authoritarian. That could be true for Podemos and for Syriza. And I think that it is not impossible, I'm thinking of Chantal Mouffe, for populism to use even liberal democracy as its host ideology. That may be correct for Podemos and may be correct for Syriza. But I think that when populists turn to socialism, generally they give it an authoritarian version. In other words, it's the combination of the host and the populist thin ideology that produces the outcome. It's not the host as such as you said, and it is not the populist thin, which in itself necessarily, because you use Syriza and Podemos to show that it need not go there. But in that case, it has to use liberal democracy as some kind of host. And I think Chantal Mouffe basically does. She's very different from Ernesto Laclau, strangely enough.
Carolyn, do we have any more people on the list?
We don't.
Could I think this last exchange was fascinating, and I'd just like to throw in one naive question, but one that has sort of hovered around my head for a very long time. On the one hand, in response to Boyan, I've often, who in his book with Mark Tushnet says that when there are, of course, a lot of authoritarian populists, but Boyan, you say these are authoritarians masquerading as populists rather than populists who have an authoritarian essence. And my question, I think I've written it, is, but why these masks? Why do they choose these masks? Why are they so convenient for these authoritarian purposes? But I then want to turn that question, and it's literally a question, I don't know the answer, to Andrew and Jean. What do we mean when we talk about a political, what do you mean when you talk about a political logic? To what extent are we talking about, is it logical? I mean, a propositional logic, A is contradictory to B. Is it a psychological logic? If you believe this, then you're going to believe that. Is it a social logic? If you do this, then you're going to do that. What exactly is logic beyond, I don't know, a trend, a tendency, an affinity? I just don't know. But logic sort of gives a kind of force to it, which a lot of other words don't, would leave more open.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say one more thing. Is he gone to Boyan? Is that
No,
his
no, he'll
name?
be there. He's there. I
To the
think.
point he raised, because I would then say, I agree with the way Andrew turned that around, but I don't think it's only the socialist ideology, that combination. I don't think it turns on the ideology that the thin ideology of populism latches onto, because we talk about many other dimensions in the 7 points, not just a thin ideology. There's the friend enemy, there's the part whole, there's the monist dynamic. Okay, so I think then the burden would be on Boyan to say, well, what is populist about? It sounds like, I mean, what's the populist part? And so I think that sort of gets lost in the shuffle. People, again, it's the same kind of phenomenon. So people in the streets say, you know, power to the people, we're the people, or whatever it is, or some political party articulates some of those ideas, but when they are in power, would he be able to identify the populist dimension? It can't just be the welfare state or social democracy or democratizing representative structures, etc. So what's the populist part? And also, I'm sorry, but with Chantal Mouffe as well. I mean, Fujimori was at one point a liberal, an economic liberal, but certainly authoritarian. And I think that the Mouffe argument is much more contradictory than Andrew made it appear, frankly. And so I don't think that her version of populist theory would avoid the logic, as we say, of an authoritarian outcome. But well, I'll stop there. I'll let Andrew answer the question about the dynamic. I think it's the dynamic. I don't think it's a hard logic in the sense of Aristotelian or other kind of logic. But
yeah, I mean, we have to be careful with the term logic,
right,
because it implies necessity, implies perhaps greater coherence than there is, and implies that if you say A, B, C, D, then E will follow necessarily, or whatever. And I think that even these cases, Podemos and Syriza, indicate, yes, you can have embodiment of the people in a group. Yes, you could have a leader. Yes, you can even demonize your enemies. But still, you can have outcomes which are different in different settings. And this will depend on lots of things, including power and ability, but it will also, to some extent, depend on the host ideology you choose. But I think in response to Boyan's point, I was trying to say that if you bring together a strong idea of leadership, charismatic leadership, friend-enemy relations, embodiment, together with socialism, you are more likely.
you just froze, Andrew.
Than if you do not make that kind of combination. And the same with nationalism and religion. So the host ideologies, of course, are more open, but populism itself is open to the extent that it can choose, or as Laclau said, float among different hosts. But the combination of populism as we define it, obviously not in other definitions, but as we define it, with these very strong ideologies, with their narratives and their ideas of justice and their idea of historical mission linked to them, would have authoritarian consequences. Yeah, maybe logic is not, it's too strong a term. Because,
no, but the main point is that the consequences would not flow from the host ideologies, but
alone,
right. So it's the populist
combination.
Right, but that's important because it means, without that, I mean, liberal democracy, fine. Where's the populism in that part? That liberal democracy can be further democratized. We argued that 30 years ago. I mean, everybody else did too. And you don't need populism for that. So what role does populism play? Anyway.
We have time for one more question, and we have a very distinguished questioner, Professor Jan Zielonka. And so we'll ask Jan to ask his question.
And I'm just bringing Jan onto the screen. Give it 1 second.
I see the name.
It's a start.
Oh, there.
There he
I
is.
think I'm with you. Apologies for the connection. Look, I was this week reviewing 3 books on democracy crisis by very distinguished people, and I was surprised to learn that they don't only find the term populist unhelpful, like Steinringer in his book, but they go even further. I just cite you what Craig Calhoun and Charles Taylor write. Populists generally do call for democracy. They seek to make the government more responsive to the people, and they reveal social challenges that conventional politics commonly fail to face or even recognize.
Yeah.
These are very powerful words, and how you would respond to this? Because even in people who actually make career about writing on populists, like Kaz Mude, recently said that they would prefer terms like right-wing nativism rather than populism. Is there simply a kind of wave against the use of the term?
Well, I mean, of course, that's a real challenge. I think Gene previously went through a list of people from Elizabeth Warren to Bernie Sanders. I don't know who else you mentioned, who in your view are not populists. And I think that to Craig Calhoun, then they are the populists par excellence. Well, of course, on this level, we can't talk about the theoretical issues that are dividing us or that we're interested in, because, I think there are people who call Obama populist, which is, of course, almost most ridiculous, but in any case, why not? If you define the term a certain way, and in the United States, that is quite general in a journalistic sense, then of course it will be critics of oligarchic democracy or elite democracy or authoritarianism who will be the populists. Yeah, okay. So we, of course, have defined our term. And so we say that we're talking about those people, those trends, those political aspirations that fit the 6-7 criteria that we work out. Not necessarily every single one of them, but most of them. And the key ones are friend-enemy relations. The key ones are embodiment. the key ones are charismatic claims of leadership. I think that those are the things. And so, yeah, I mean, do they fit Elizabeth Sanders? I don't think so. Elizabeth Warren, not even Bernie Sanders. So in any
Because
case,
they are not enough charismatic.
No. I think, well,
they don't have a friend-enemy relationship. That's the key. Who are demonized by Elizabeth Warren? When have you heard her? When have you heard her demonize anybody? Doesn't even demonize poor Trump, right?
Anyway, I think that we can clarify. I just thought of a way to clarify this, maybe. We write the book. I became involved in the book because, well, we got Trump. I mean, people start writing about populism when it's a real threat. Latin America beat us to it, Italy way before. Okay, so the reason, the concern is and was the authoritarian dangers often associated with populism. I don't think it's exogenous. I think it's endogenous. But in it, which does not mean that every populist is an authoritarian. But so that was the interest in the book, because we were concerned about the threats to democracy, and we clearly what Trump did when he came to power vindicated our concerns, as elsewhere. Most places, 99% of places. Okay, so that's an important dimension. So on the other hand, populists purport not so much the right wrongs, because they're really more, but they also do. But they're even when they went to white supremacy or nationalism and or various stripes in Europe, they purport to be within the democratic majority, imaginary, and to speak for the majority of the people. Why do they say that? Because it's a democratic idea. Now, to say that they don't want democracy, they just want more responsiveness, I think that's misleading. I think by the way, I think they don't want either one. Well, let me put this another way. The responsiveness and wanting more democracy is the discourse of all of the populists. And of course, that's how they mobilize people to support them. And so, again, I'm not even imagining some nefarious leader who's manipulating the people behind. That's not the point. The point is that we have to reflect on why it is that populism, especially when in power, does what it does. And we left out one big thing. For example, I think the anti-establishment dimension of it is quite central to the authoritarian tendencies. I won't use the word logic, because once you're in power and you're still anti-authoritarian, once you're in power and you're still mobilizing people against the establishment when you are the establishment, that is a very dangerous dynamic. And what it leads to is attacks on what? Attacks on the state. Now, and of course, in the name of attacking the so-called deep state, they conflate the two. By definition, the state is the deep state. And we know, at least in the United States, your own cases, what the ways in which Trump tried to undermine, government officials, government agencies who are basically doing their jobs, adhering to the norm of impartiality and functioning. You can't have a democracy without a functioning state. And what do they try to do? They, in the classic populist fashion, their version of corruption is precisely to undermine that kind of state, which a democracy needs, and replace it with their own deep state, all the while claiming they are going against the deep state. So I think that it's wrong. It's misleading. There is to frame populists as just wanting more responsiveness. Then it kind of sounds like some people are suffering. They are not doing well economically, and so no one's responding to them, and they should be responded to. I think that's not enough to give us what a concept of populism is. And I think to say that you don't need a concept of populism because this is other concepts can deal with that one phenomena is doesn't lead us to understand, I think, the threat that populism poses to democracy. And
if I can just address that from the other side, I mean, there's clearly, in 1989, right, 1990, we were all enthusiastic about the coming democratization of so many places. And we saw a real possibility and real progress. And And now, 30 years later, we see a lot of move in the other direction. There's so many authoritarian experiments all over the world. So we need to explain it. And in a way, one of the possible explanations of it is that the democratic ideal is itself internally contradictory. It has difficult tension between different components of it. And populism is a way of or what we call populism, is a way of exploiting those tensions and moving them in an authoritarian direction. That's, of course, not going to be true for every single thing called populism by the daily press. But I think you see this certainly. I mean, just one question, the freedom of the press, right? The freedom of free media. It's under attack everywhere. I know that Poles, you have still Gazeta Wyborcza. I don't know how it survives, but in Hungary, there is nothing like that left, right? And I think you can see everywhere that, and you could see this in Trump, who did not have the power to abolish the freedom of any actual organ, is that the attack on fake news, the attack on the normal press is a constant element of this. And why? Where does that come from? Where does it come from? So I think populism, if it's defined properly, can give you one key to understand why this is happening.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. This has been a terrific discussion of a terrific book. And as with this, populism is a gift that keeps on giving, because you keep giving answers and they lead to other questions. And as a result, this webinar series, which only began because of COVID and we had nothing else we could do, is unlikely ever to end, I suspect. And this is our 12th, and we will begin in the new year further continuation of the series. And thank you so much, Jean and Andrew. It's been a terrific discussion.
Please put us on the list. Put us on your list.
You're on the list. You can't escape.
There's no escape. That's exactly right, Martin. There's no escape.
No
Thank
escape.
you all.
I mean,
Thank you.
well, he means for the webinars, because we didn't know about them before.
Right. Well, now, just to repeat for everyone else, all the webinars except this one, of course, which will need to be edited, and the last one with Wojciech, which is in the process of editing, are archived and on our website, globalconpop.blog. They're also available on YouTube, and they're available apparently, but I don't understand how, as a podcast. And you can't escape. So thank you again.